The episode discusses how caffeine affects the body. It includes personal experiences with caffeine and features experts discussing its effects.
Okay, my alarm goes off in the morning. Sometimes I hit the snooze. I try really hard not to. Finally, I drag myself out of sleep, stumble down the stairs, and reach for that sweet, sweet cold brew. Dollop of oat milk. Day can begin. Sound familiar? Well, for many, a cup of coffee is what gets us through the day, or 2 cups, or 3. Now, there are plenty of other ways to get caffeine, energy drinks, even gummies. We heard from plenty of you about your relationship with caffeine.
My name is Shelley Duncan. I'm from Kansas, and I just wanted to say I love coffee, and I call it my happy juice, and I need it every morning.
My name is Jesse De La Cruz Sanchez. Coffee is something that I need every day on a regular basis, maybe twice a day, just to go through the day. It makes me feel amazing. It wakes me up.
My name is Paul from Largo, Florida, via New York. What I do is I get some Starbucks beans over there at Publix, and I take them home and I roast them again in the oven, and then I put them in a little bowl, and as I'm working, I just chew them. So then I take, 8 or 10 usually, in a half hour, and check the caffeine level buzz I got, and then if I need a little more, I chew a few more, and then I brush my teeth.
All right, Paul, you're really going for it. Thanks for those messages. So how does caffeine affect our body? For this edition of our In Good Health series, we're taking a closer look at caffeine and answering your questions. We meet our panel after the break, and a quick reminder, they're not a substitute for talking to your own doctor about health concerns. I'm Jen White. You're listening to the 1A podcast, where we get to the heart of this story. We'll be back after this quick break. Let's bring in our guests. Jennifer Temple is a professor of exercise and nutrition sciences and director of the Nutrition and Health Research Laboratory at University at Buffalo. She also has a doctorate in neuroscience. Jen, welcome to 1A.
Thanks for having me.
Also with us is Dr. Stephen DeVries. He's the executive director of the Gaples Institute. That's an educational nonprofit with the mission of advancing the role of nutrition in medicine. He's also a preventative cardiologist and an adjunct associate professor of nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Steve, it's great to have you.
Thank you. Great to be with you to talk about such an energizing topic.
So, Jen, we heard from so many people about how often they drink coffee. When you take away the coffee, the flavor, the water, and you're left with just the caffeine, what is that substance?
So caffeine is a substance that occurs naturally in the leaves and beans of certain kinds of plants. And it is a substance that acts within our system to do all the things that the caller said it did. So it makes us feel more alert. It makes us feel more awake. It makes us feel more energized. And we are getting it from more and more places nowadays. So it's not just the naturally occurring sources that like coffee and tea, but we're getting it in soft drinks. We're getting it in energy drinks where it's present as an additive.
Steve, how does caffeine stimulate our body and our hearts?
Yeah. Well, caffeine works by blocking a set of biologic docking stations in the body. They're called adenosine receptors. So when caffeine blocks these receptors, it sets in motion a series of reactions, including ones that increase the availability of dopamine in the brain. That's a feel-good chemical. And they boost levels of adrenaline that can help you to focus. And caffeine also does a lot of other stimulating things in the body. It increases blood flow to different organs, including the kidneys, which is responsible for that well-known diuretic effect. And caffeine can also stimulate the movement of the gut, causing many people to need to head to the bathroom. So lots of stimulation related to caffeine, literally from top to bottom.
Jen, the FDA has guidelines for caffeine consumption. They say 400 milligrams of caffeine is generally a safe amount for adults to take, and that's typically about 4 cups of coffee. But there's a wide variation in how sensitive people can be to caffeine. How much does caffeine tolerance differ from person to person?
It differs a lot. And what ends up happening is people get a sense of how sensitive they are as an individual. And so because caffeine is so ubiquitous, we tend to start to sample caffeinated beverages when we're children. And so people tend to learn over time if they are very sensitive to caffeine, and they often avoid it. And then people like me learn over time that they can drink quite a bit of caffeine without having any negative side effects. And some of that also can change over time depending on how much you consume it. So if you are a regular consumer of caffeine, you can develop a tolerance to the caffeine, and that allows your body to be able to handle consuming more and more caffeine.
What makes some people more tolerant of caffeine?
So there's a lot of variability in both the enzymes that metabolize caffeine in your body. So some people metabolize caffeine more quickly than others. And then, as Steve mentioned, there's variability in the adenosine system. So some people have more or less adenosine receptors. So some people are able to respond more or less to that caffeine.
Steve, as a cardiologist, how important is it to consider our heart's ability to handle stimulants like coffee? Or like caffeine, I should say more broadly.
Yeah, it varies greatly from individual to individual. Some people are extremely sensitive and will note the development of palpitations, an increased awareness of your heartbeat. For other people, acutely drinking a lot of coffee can increase blood pressure. But what's interesting is that regular, moderate consumption of caffeine doesn't typically raise blood pressure for most people. But again, the key is individuals vary. So although, the averages don't apply to specific individuals, but generally speaking, not a huge effect on blood pressure. So it really is more of an individual response.
Well, and Jen, take us deeper into how our brains respond to caffeine, because I notice with myself, like I said, I got to have that coffee first thing in the morning. But I notice that there's sort of a threshold for me where if I drink more than 2 cups closely together, then I start to experience this. It's not a headache and it's not exactly brain fog, but I can feel something happening in my mind, and I just start drinking a lot of water to try, I don't know if it's effective or not, but to try to flush some of the caffeine out of my system.
Yeah. So again, this is also really varies from individual to individual. But what caffeine typically is doing in your brain is, again, adenosine is a neurotransmitter whose job it is to kind of slow us down, make us feel tired, make us feel sleepy. And so caffeine antagonizes that system. And so when we have caffeine, it's going to make us feel more alert and more energized. But when we have too much, that too much can feel very different in different people. So what you're describing is maybe some effects on the vascular system, where you might start to feel what you might feel if you're a little bit dehydrated, where you feel this urge to drink more water to sort of counteract that. Other people feel jittery, feel anxious. Some people feel really nauseous. But most people, as they're consuming too much, they have some sort of physiological reaction that tells them to stop before it gets to the point where it gets really dangerous and you start getting some of these cardiovascular side effects.
We're going to take a quick break here, but when we come back, how does your caffeine source affect the way you feel? Back with more in just a moment. Let's get back to the conversation with this message we got from Daryl.
This is Daryl from Virginia. I was a longtime user of caffeine in my day job in the city, and I've shied away from it. And now it seems I've realized how strong and potent it is. What is the difference, or is there a difference, between where your caffeine is derived, i.e. energy drink versus matcha? I don't know if it's psychosomatic or something in my head, but I feel like there's a difference in the type of energy I receive depending on where I get the caffeine from. Yerba mate seems to be the best.
Daryl, thanks for that question. Jennifer, how much does it matter where we're getting our caffeine from?
So this is something that people commonly report, that depending on where you get it from, you feel different things. The caffeine is the caffeine. The chemical structure of the caffeine is the same, whether you get it from a natural source like coffee and tea, or whether it's an additive like in energy drinks or soda. But what may be happening is that the caffeine is interacting with other ingredients that are contained within those beverages that are making it have a different effect on your body. So for example, caffeine plus sugar might have a different effect. Those that might have an additive effect with one another. And there's lots of other things in energy drinks. There's both added caffeine, and then there's more natural sources of caffeine like guarana, and then there's amino acids and vitamins and minerals, and all of these things might interact with the caffeine or have other effects in your body that are complementary to the caffeine. And so that's probably what people are experiencing. It's not necessarily a difference in the caffeine itself. Again, the chemical structure is the same.
I want to get to this email from John who says, I'm 72 and probably have averaged no more than 6 hours of sleep per night since I was 16 and went to work. I managed to maintain my A average in school. Coffee felt essential. When I started having atrial fibrillation, I had to start eliminating my triggers. Caffeine was one. A Panera Bread is facing 2 wrongful death lawsuits. That's after 2 people died drinking their charged lemonades in September and October. These are caffeinated lemonades. One of the plaintiffs, who had a heart condition, drank 1 large cup. The other plaintiff had high blood pressure and drank 3. And 1 large cup of the charged lemonade contained 390 milligrams of nearly 4 cups of coffee's equivalent. How wary should we be of caffeine in drinks, especially when it's not immediately apparent? Steve?
Yeah, I think, it's really concerning when caffeine is kind of hidden in drinks that it may not be suspected in, like the example of lemonade. And I think, even exposing it to children makes it especially concerning in that setting. But absolutely, there is not only the presence of caffeine, but the amount of caffeine and the combination in various drinks can be very concerning. Some of the energy drinks have 200 milligrams or much more of caffeine, in addition to a variety of other stimulating additives that are combined, that not only may be additive, but synergistic, like adding up to more than the sum of their parts. So I think that it's important to consider that these drinks also are not just vehicles for caffeine, but they're whole kind of families of chemicals. In the case of coffee, there's many positive ones. There's a whole hundreds of phytochemicals that are present in coffee. Many of them look to be very protective. But when you go to extracting caffeine and putting it in very high concentrations in things like lemonade or energy drinks, then you're combining it with other ingredients that are not necessarily healthful and, as the listeners pointed out, may be very harmful.
Well, Jen, as we've been saying, caffeine isn't just in coffee and tea. It's in a plethora of sodas and energy drinks and gummies. How are different caffeine products regulated?
That's a really good question. So the Food and Drug Administration regulates caffeine as an additive in things that are considered foods and beverages. So there's an upper limit to how much caffeine can be added, which is 70 milligrams per 12 ounces. There are a pretty narrow range of caffeine added to soda, so anywhere between about 40 milligrams up to 55 milligrams per 12 ounces. But energy drinks and energy shots are not considered beverages by the Food and Drug Administration. They're considered supplements because of the other ingredients that they contain. So because they have vitamins and minerals and amino acids added to them, they are not considered beverages, and therefore the FDA does not limit the amount of caffeine that can be added to them.
So if you're a consumer and you're looking at one of these drinks or these shots, what information should you look for on the label?
I would recommend that people do look for the amount of caffeine. While it's not required that they label it, the American Beverage Association recommends that energy drink manufacturers put the amount of caffeine on there, and most of them do. So that can give you a place to start. But as Steve mentioned, there are synergistic effects of both the added caffeine and some of the more natural sources of caffeine and the other ingredients that are contained within these beverages, especially energy drinks. So I would just urge people to be cautious in general when they're thinking about consuming these things, because people may have a history of caffeine consumption and have not had any negative effects, but could have some negative side effects of consuming these drinks because of the synergy with the other ingredients.
Here's a question we got for you, Steve. This comes from John. I read recently that 5 cups of coffee a day has wonderful benefits for a healthy liver. Is there any truth to this?
There is some data that certain sorts of liver conditions may be improved with caffeine. 5 cups of coffee is the outer limit for most people. So I wouldn't recommend that offhand for people dealing with specific liver conditions, but there is some preliminary data for certain sorts of liver conditions. There's a whole variety, so it's a little bit more complicated than could be answered quickly. But yeah, lots of data for, such a range of conditions, from Parkinson's to diabetes. We could get more into that, but it's really incredible some of the benefits that, again, not caffeine per se, but coffee and tea in particular have been associated with.
Tell us more.
Yeah. So, right off the bat, coffee consumption has been associated with health benefits that include improved longevity. And there was a study that came out just a couple of years ago that showed a 29% reduced mortality over a long term by coffee drinkers. And this is generally in the range of 2 to 4 cups of coffee per day. So the 4 cups would be kind of the outer limit for most. A few studies as many as 5 cups. In addition to just overall longevity, there's a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease that is associated with coffee and tea consumption. And actually, interestingly, reduced risk of diabetes. And that is interesting since diabetes is affecting so many individuals now. More than 12% of the U.S. public has diabetes. Interesting that coffee has been helpful. And actually, in the prevention of Parkinson's, there is some data showing that coffee can be helpful. So again, more than the caffeine, this is the whole kind of stew of phytochemicals, these health-promoting chemicals from plants that coffee and tea contain.
Jen, how does caffeine, or maybe it's coffee or tea specifically, how does it affect our mood?
So because of its effects on us feeling more energized and us feeling more alert, that can also have these effects on our mood. So we just feel more positive. People report that they feel happier, they feel more optimistic, they feel more energized. And I think it's important to point out, because all of these callers are talking about, they wake up in the morning and they feel blah, and then they have caffeine and it makes them feel better. And that's one of the main effects of caffeine. So because it has a very short half-life, it moves out of our system really quickly. By the time you wake up in the morning, you don't really have any caffeine left. And so what you're feeling is kind of the effects of the withdrawal from that caffeine. And so you need the caffeine to kind of just even bring you up to kind of a steady state or a baseline that somebody that maybe doesn't ever consume caffeine might wake up at. And so there's this common theme, and I'm a daily coffee drinker as well. And so I feel the same way. So you just feel tired and sluggish, and the caffeine, you need the caffeine to kind of bring you up. And so that's kind of that effect on mood, is sort of counteracting the withdrawal effects from not having caffeine overnight.
Steve, why can drinking caffeine make people feel anxious?
Yeah, well, it is a stimulant. And, it just kind of reminds me, this caller's question, of a general concept in medicine, and that is when there is something that is off, the first thing to think about is, one of the medicines that you're consuming. And although caffeine generally isn't considered a medicine, it is a drug. So absolutely, anxiety and agitation are also, very common, and obviously so many reasons for it. But caffeine is one of them. So if individuals are experiencing undue agitation or anxiety, that it's a problem in their life, it is worthwhile to consider that coffee or tea could be part of it, and more could be cola, beverages that have caffeine, cold beverages. It could be a lot of chocolate, anything that has caffeine. But certainly that the caller's experience is one that I think people should really consider if they're dealing with anxiety or agitation.
Well, Jen, you have a specific research interest with caffeine consumption in children. We heard earlier from Samala, who says she started drinking coffee when she was 5 years old. What have you noticed about the effects caffeine can have on young children when it comes to anxiety?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have to say right off the bat that anxiety isn't something that we actually measured in the studies that we did in my lab, but it's something that I explored as part of a review article I wrote a few years ago, where we're really starting to recognize the link between caffeine and symptoms of anxiety or even depression and other mental health conditions, where caffeine can exacerbate some of those mental health conditions, and that can happen in children as well as adults. And so, again, we didn't measure that outcome specifically, but it's also important to echo what Steve said earlier about there's really not a lot of research on, or no research in humans, to really chronicle the impact of caffeine on the developing brain, which is why it is not recommended that children consume caffeine, especially children under the age of 12. So there's a lot of unknowns out there. And part of the reason for the unknowns is that it's not ethical for us to do the randomized control trials we would need to do, where we give kids high doses of caffeine for months and months, and then we measure these outcome variables. So a lot of what we know about this is really just kind of asking kids how much caffeine they consume and then asking them about their mood or their mental health, and then seeing what the correlations are. But that's not scientifically rigorous in the way that we would like it to be.
Let's pause here for just a moment. Still ahead, can you stop drinking coffee cold turkey? We get to it after the break. Steve, this conversation was prompted by a discussion I had with one of our producers about her having sleep trouble. And as we kind of talked through her day, I asked her, well, wait, are you drinking caffeine in the afternoon? And she's like, oh, just a Coke. And I said,
there you go.
That might be doing it.
You sleuthed it out.
I sleuthed it out. Tell us more about how caffeine interferes with our sleep patterns.
Well, it can be a vicious cycle because people drink caffeine to kind of get a boost in the morning, sometimes at noon, sometimes in the afternoon. And what can happen is they have trouble sleeping. So the next day, they're fatigued, and the answer is, more coffee. They'll be drinking very high amounts of caffeine. Their sleep will be disturbed often, and then you get into this vicious cycle of more and more and more and more until your thinking becomes really obscured and all kinds of problems happen. So it's not an uncommon sort of progression, and it's one that does require some intervention. It was great advice that he was given to you can't cut cold turkey if you're wishing to do that. You really need to cut down gradually. If you try to cut cold turkey, what happens to a lot of people is that they feel really bad. They get bad headaches, they get extremely fatigued, and they feel like, well, I guess I really need this caffeine, and they find that they can't get off it. But it's the gradual taper that is generally much more successful.
Hey, Jen, what do we know about how caffeine affects kids' sleeping habits?
Yeah, so caffeine definitely disrupts kids' sleeping habits. And because children have a shorter history with consuming caffeine, they tend to be more sensitive to it, and they don't have the same level of tolerance that many of us do because we are habitual consumers. And so kids might have a negative effect of sleep even if they have a soda at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which might seem relatively innocuous to us, but they can have sleep disrupted with much lower levels of caffeine. And there are so many things in kids' environments today that are competing with sleep and sleep quality, like screen time, for example, that adding caffeine to that mix can just really exacerbate those negative effects. So when I talk to parents, one of the things that I recommend is really no caffeine, especially in kids younger than 12. But if kids are going to have caffeine, really try to limit it in terms of amount and limit it to earlier in the day. The longer you can, or the more distance you can put between caffeine consumption and sleep, the better for kids.
Here's a message we got from Guy, who emails, years ago I was at a family gathering and came down with a debilitating headache. I then learned that I had been drinking decaf for 2 days. I'm sorry, Guy. After getting a big cup of real coffee at a store down the street, I was back to normal in less than an hour. And then Liz emailed, can you talk about decaf coffees and if they have an effect on sleep? How much decaf equals how much regular coffee? I mean, Jen, is there caffeine in decaf?
There is a very small amount of caffeine in decaffeinated coffee. So decaffeinated coffee is sort of the caffeine is removed from the coffee and there are trace amounts, but it is very unlikely that it would be enough to make people have negative effects. It's lower than the amount that you find in chocolate. So it's not something that that we typically worry about. And maybe Steve can talk a little bit about this more, but some of the benefits of coffee have actually been found in decaf coffee as well. And so decaf coffee can have health benefits without any of the potential negative effects of caffeine for somebody that might be sensitive.
And Steve, what can you tell us?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Again, the benefits associated with coffee and tea are not necessarily related to the caffeine, certainly not the caffeine alone. So what is fascinating is that decaf coffee is also associated with an increase in longevity and also associated with a reduced rate of cardiovascular events. So that means that it must be this whole mix of phytochemicals, and there are hundreds of them. There are ones that are anti-inflammatory. There are ones that prevent certain harmful reactions in the body from taking place called antioxidants. So absolutely, and they obviously don't depend on caffeine since decaf coffee is helpful. So that is absolutely true. I did want to point out one other thing. We've talked about caffeine in children. In one area I wanted to mention that's especially concerning to me, and I think it's so unfortunate, is that energy drinks are often sold in middle school and high school cafeterias and made accessible through the school system. I'm not sure what exactly the reason for that is, but I can't imagine the havoc that it is raising for many of these children having such not only ready access, but kind of the stamp of approval from the school. So I did want to point that out. It would be really, I think, helpful for listeners to inquire if they've got school-age children, what is being served in their school cafeteria. And if energy drinks are part of it, it probably is something that should be looked at and, I believe, removed.
Well, you have time for one more message.
Hi, this is Katie from Cary, North Carolina, and I was curious about what is considered a healthy way to wean ourselves off caffeine. Is it just cold turkey? And, how can we be more mindful of how caffeine is affecting our bodies?
Thanks for that message, Katie. First of all, Stephen, why is weaning off caffeine not as easy as we may think?
Well, it is a drug, and we become habituated to the effect that the body is used to receiving this drug, and has a certain way of kind of responding in the world with that drug on board. And so withdrawing from caffeine, if people are moderate or heavy consumers regularly, kind of stopping that quickly kind of jolts the body into a panic mode. And so I would say, again, the idea is not to stop abruptly, but if you wanted to kind of check in, and I think this is useful, check in with your body to see, what is the effect of the coffee or tea consumption that I have on my body. The only way to find out is to drop down a little bit and see what effect that has. So I would advise people, if they do want to cut down, they not quit cold turkey, but they maybe switch the number of beverages containing caffeine to maybe drop them in half for a week, and then maybe a half again. Another option would be to people to switch from a highly caffeinated drink like certain kinds of coffee to less caffeinated beverages like black tea. A cup of black tea generally has less than half the amount of caffeine as in a similar amount of brewed coffee, or green tea, even less caffeine. And that might be another way of keeping some of the caffeine on board if they want to, like the effect or like the taste, but also to cut back on the amount that they're consuming.
And really briefly, Steve, what are some things we should pay attention to in our bodies that might indicate, might be time to kind of wean ourselves off of caffeine?
Yeah, people are having difficulties either getting to sleep or staying asleep. That would be one clue. Another one, people dealing with agitation or anxiety would be another. And then in general, people with heartburn symptoms, also they're very common. It could be a relation to caffeine, so that would be a good indication. The other group, just people to consider their caffeine content, are people women who wish to conceive or who are pregnant. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recommend limiting caffeine to under 200 milligrams. So that would be generally 2 regular-sized cups of coffee or less. So these are groups that really need to think about limiting their intake.
That's Dr. Stephen DeVries. He's a preventative cardiologist and the executive director of the Gaples Institute. That's an educational nonprofit with the mission of advancing the role of nutrition in medicine. Also with us, Jennifer Temple. She's a professor of exercise and nutrition sciences and director of the Nutrition and Health Research Laboratory at University at Buffalo. Jen, Steve, thanks for speaking with us.